Today, we're going to be talking about my top 6 drum tips that I use in almost every mix. So if you struggle to mix drum set and your drums usually sound like this, well, in this video, you're going to learn how to make them sound like this. Let's get started. Hello everybody, Dylan Pines here with Musician on a Mission, and I've got another mix tutorial for you. Today we are talking drums, drum set, one of the hardest things to mix and one of the things that makes your mix sound the most amateurish of all of your instruments. So we're going to be going over 6 of my favorite tips for mixing drum set. These are all different things that I do in almost every single mix. Now, this won't get you to a finished drum set sound. There's still going to be things that you need to add, but these are 6 things that I always make sure to try to do in my mixes. But before we get started, I want to let you know we're giving away a free bonus. We actually have made a cheat sheet for recording drums, something that a lot of you have been asking for. And as you know, recording drums is really, really hard. There's a lot of microphones involved, and there's a lot of stuff that can go wrong. So this cheat sheet graphically shows you where to place each microphone on your drum set, whether you're trying to mic the snare, or your toms, or your kick, or the overheads, or even a few really cool, specific sounding drum recording techniques. It's got all of it in there. So just click the link on screen or down in the description below, and we'll send it to you for free. Hopefully you're going to get much better drum sounds after that. So let's get right into it. Right here, you can see that I've got a drum setup. I don't have any processing on it. It's just the raw tracks. I've got a few kick mics, a few snare mics, my overheads, and a few room mics. Pretty stereotypical drum setup. Let's go straight into tip number 1, which is to set up drum buses and sub buses. This might be basic for some, but it's going to be revolutionary for others if you're not already doing this. I know for me, it was huge. So what I mean by buses and sub buses is that you should route all of your kick mics to one specific bus, all of your snare mics to one bus, your overheads to one bus, your rooms to one bus. That way, you can actually affect the entire kick sound on a single channel. You don't have to put an EQ on every kick microphone or every snare microphone. Plus, you can get your tonal balance right with the volume faders on the individual channels, but to turn the actual kick up or down, you only have to have one fader, and that's your sub-bus fader. So let me bring this up right now. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to go to my mixer, I'm going to go to my output, I'm going to change it to a bus. Say bus 2. I'm going to do that really quickly for each of these. So bus 2 and rooms. So now I'm going to make an actual track of all of these, and I'm going to go back to my arrangement window, and I'm going to drag them where I want them to go. So the rooms are going to go here, the overheads are going to go here, the snare is going to go right here. So check this out. If I solo out the kick and I turn it down, that is going to turn down the volume of the entire kick, even though you can see over here, it's still going. This is what we use buses for. You get one fader to affect all of your mics, and you get one channel to do all of your processing. So now that we've created our sub buses, let's create our actual instrument bus. So I'm going to go back to my mixer, and I'm going to select all 3 of these sub buses, and I'm going to change their output to bus 1. And I'm just going to call this drum bus. Let's create the track, and there we have it. So if I solo out my drum bus, that is the sound that we want. That's the entire drum set. And if I was to turn it down, same thing. It turns down everything, and I can add a little bit of processing on there to get everything to really get glued together. If you use Logic Pro, there's an easier way to do this. So if you don't use Logic Pro, just skip ahead in the video. It might not be necessary for you. But if you do, check this out. So I'm going to quickly undo everything I just did, and I'm going to create buses, but I'm also going to create some organization. So I'm going to right click and I'm going to create a track stack. And I'm going to select summing stack. Boom. And what this does is it makes a little folder for you, but that folder doubles as a sub bus. And then for each of these, we're going to do the same thing. We are going to select our bus, and that's going to be our drum bus. So now all I have to do is grab all of these, and I've got some handy little folders that all act as buses. So that's my first tip. I do that on 100% of the mixes that I have. That is going to be huge when it comes to speed and when it comes to creating glue later on. Let's move on to my next tip, and that is tip number 2, to check the phase of all of your microphones. So what do I mean by phase? Well, basically, whenever two sound waves that are coming from the same source, whenever they align with each other, then that source becomes louder. But whenever they become unaligned, like for instance, when the peak gets aligned with the trough, then they cancel each other out. And whenever you're using multiple microphones on a single source, this is a really, really common occurrence. So it's in your best interest to go into the actual audio files themselves and try to see if you've got any kind of phase cancellation going. Really what this means for us is not that it's going to get rid of a sound entirely, but it's more going to have some tone suck. We're going to lose a lot of lows and low mids if we have some phasing going on. So some people like to mess with their phase by using a polarity flip button. I actually don't do that. I'm a fan of getting a little bit dirty, get my hands dirty, and actually moving around waveforms. So let me show you what I'm talking about. So right here you can see, my kick in mic was closer to the sound, closer to the beater than my kick out mic was. Now what that means is that it took longer for the sound to go from my kick to the microphone that was sitting outside of it. And because of that, there's a literal time difference between these two, right? And because there's a time difference, you can see right here, there's a trough, there's a wave trough that's aligned with a peak. So that's causing some tone suck. And you can see the same things happening with the sub as well. Let me solo these two out. It's kind of a weak sound, but to fix it, it's pretty simple. Just go in here. I usually like to set my marker kind of right at a crossover point for a wave and try to align those crossover points and then hit play. Now it's subtle, of course, but it's something that has a huge difference by the end of a mix. If it's something that you don't do at the beginning of a mix, it can be catastrophic by the end, even if in the moment you're kind of like, it's not that different. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go through each of these drums and do some phase aligning. And I'm going to do that exact style that I was doing before. I'm just going to put my cursor in the spot where the crossover is, and then I'm going to move these audio files around so that they're all kind of sitting at that same area. So here's our kick. Finally, let's go check out our rooms. So our rooms are a little bit different because we are wanting not necessarily to get them exactly aligned, because I have two different room mics, right? I've got my close room mic and my far room mic. The fact that there is a delay in time between the two, because it takes the sound longer to travel from one mic to the next mic, that kind of gives us this perception of depth. Like our ear interprets that as, oh, that is from farther away. I don't really want to lose that. So I'm going to try to get it close, but I'm not going to actually try to get them to sit at the exact same starting spot, because I'm going to lose the depth that I've created by simply having a farther microphone. So all I'm going to try to do, like I said, is just get it relatively close. Like right now, these peaks and troughs are aligning. I don't want that. So I'm going to just get it kind of close, maybe like right there. And I'm going to go kind of move around and check and see if I've caused any problems elsewhere in the waveform. So it looks pretty close to being good. Here's the extra trick to this. We've gone through, we've made sure all of these separate microphones are sounding good by themselves, but the extra mile is to compare all of them together. You're going to get a truly great drum sound if you're able to go in and make sure that your kicks are aligned with themselves, but then your kicks are aligned with your snares and your overheads and your rooms. You want everything to align with everything else, at least as much as you can. Again, I don't want to sacrifice depth. I'm not trying to get perfect alignment, but I do want to make sure that there's no troughs that are on top of peaks. So let's first check out our snare, because our overheads, for whatever reason, just captured a lot more of the snare sound. So it's just going to be easier to see how to align them. So it looks like, our overheads are quite a bit behind. What I can do is I can either move these so that they are perfectly aligned, or I can move them to where they're kind of close. I'm just going to solo out the snare of the overheads. Actually, I'll solo the kick as well, because the kick should now be pretty tight with the overheads. So now let's move on to tip number 3, which is to check for boxiness. Now, this is something that gets thrown around all the time on the internet, like, oh, your drums are boxy sometimes. Like, you want to make sure that you check for that. And why do we use that word boxy? We didn't actually just pick that at random, even though no one really knows what the inside of a cardboard box sounds like. It's because of that sound, boxy, ba, ah, ah. That sound tends to live between like 200 and 700 hertz-ish, somewhere around there. And if you have too much energy in some specific areas around there, you can get this sort of boxy sound. It's a sound that's really common in untreated rooms or in poorly treated rooms. And so whenever you're recording at home, you probably have boxy sounds. It's the calling card of amateur drums. So let's go through each of these drums and see if we can find some boxiness. I'm going to just solo the overheads. I'm going to grab an EQ, and I'm just going to grab a little band right here, and I'm going to sweep it around that area, that like 200 to 700 hertz. And I'm going to be thinking about that word, boxy, ba. Let's see if we can find something. Yeah, I'm kind of hearing some right there. Let me keep going. Kind of hearing it there too. Remember, ba, ba. So if I solo this, you can kind of hear it. Ba, 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 ba. If we go back here, you kind of hear a little bit more of like a bon sound. Bon, 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 right? Both of those, to me at least, feel like they are, like there's just too much going on there. So I'm going to make some cuts. Okay, that's sounding tighter. So what's the final thing I want to do? Well, I want to make sure that I gain stage my EQ, because even though I might have just taken out some really good stuff, I also just made it sound quieter. And for whatever reason, psychologically, the human ear tends to not prefer quieter sounds. So I might listen to it and I might be like, I don't really think it's helping all that much. But really, I just haven't turned the volume up. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to grab a loudness meter. You can use a loudness meter. You can use a VU meter. You can even use a peak meter if you want to use that. And I'm just going to try to get them to sit around the same area before and after. Okay, so it's kind of sitting around like 31, 32. So now it's sitting around like 34-ish. So let's just turn this up by 2 decibels. And now we can actually do a before and after and see if it helps. Definitely a lot tighter. So now let's go and check out the rooms. I'm kind of hearing that like bonk, bonk kind of sound again. probably going to want to cut there. Again, think like fa, 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 getting that like ba, 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 ba kind of sound. So it looks like I'm going to be cutting around the same area here as I did on my overheads. And that's pretty common. That could just be where in this particular room that this was recorded in, where there might be some pretty big dramatic room resonances or like increases in energy just because of the way the room is shaped. So I'm going to hit play and let's start cutting. So let's do some gain staging. Just kind of look at around where it's sitting. It's about 38. Now let's turn it on. So now it's sitting at around 40. So it looks like we lost about 2 dBs again. So now we can actually do a before and after. It's a lot tighter. It lost a lot of that sort of amateurish quality. Now, it's important for me to say, this is something that I'm going to be checking for in every mix. This isn't necessarily something that I'm going to be doing in every single mix. If there isn't a boxy problem, totally fine. We will move on. We won't make any cuts, anything like that. But if there is a boxy problem, then I'm going to be very happy that I took care of it now. So let me grab the entire drum bus and let's just check out the whole thing before and after, because this is going to make a pretty big difference in our sound. It's like it tightens up so much. It loses the amateur quality that it had. It's a huge, huge help. This is the reason why I check this with every single mix, is I really want to make sure if there is that boxy sound that I can get rid of it, rebalance everything, and get a professional drum sound. So let's move on to our next drum tip. Tip number 4, use some light filtering to create space in your drum set. Now, this is something that I love doing. You know, it's a little controversial because I'm cutting out some stuff that maybe you've seen other YouTube videos tell you not to cut, but I'm cool with it. I like it. I think it really helps, especially down the line later on in the mix. So whenever I say light filtering, let me show you what I mean. I'm going to bring up another EQ. I'm going to basically use some high pass filters and some low pass filters to actually cut some of the sound out. Now, you might be thinking like, oh my God, Dylan, why would you do that? You're going to get a really thin sound. You're going to lose all the body. It's going to be a nightmare. Here's what I mean. Right now, most people who say like, don't do any filtering, they're talking about really aggressive filters, like 24 dBs per octave. Filters where anything below the cutoff line is gone. That's not the filtering I'm talking about. I'm talking about using only 6 dBs or 12 dBs per octave, so a really, really light slope. What this does is it effectively sort of just lessens the amount of a particular area. It helps to create space for other drums without actively making the tone sound fake, without causing severe tone suck. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to sit and think, what frequency ranges do each of my drums live in? Obviously, my kick lives mostly in the lows, but the upper mids are still really important to actually hearing the kick. My snare tends to live in the lower mids and the upper mids. My overheads, those are mostly the highs. You know, those are all of my cymbals with a little bit of my drums as well. And then my rooms, those are mostly your mids. You know, because they are farther away, they're not as bright. High frequencies lose energy over time, so the farther they have to travel, the less bright they are. And the lows are less important because usually you want some really dry low sounds. You want just the lows from the kick to be coming through. So I'm going to do some filtering to create space for each of those drums. Let's start off with our kick. I'm going to get up a new EQ, and I don't want to cut anything in the lows. I want the lows, but I am going to cut some of the highs. So I'm going to grab a high cut, and I'm going to change it to about 6 dBs per octave. And I'm going to start sweeping it down until I start to really lose the tone of the kick. I don't want to dramatically change the tone or anything like that. I just want to create some space. See, like that's too far because I started losing some of the like bite of the kick. I don't really want to do that. Take it back a bit. I feel like I could go up just a bit higher here. Let's take it to about right here. And you can see I'm only really turning down stuff that's above the kick anyway. But what this is going to do is help to create space for the overheads. And that's because I want my lows to come from the kick close mics, but I want kind of most of the highs of the kick to come from the overheads. That's where I'm going to be getting the majority of that sound. So I want to make sure that I create space for that sound. Let's move on to our snare. Our snare doesn't need much in the lows, doesn't need much in the highs. I'm going to go in, do some light filtering, create our space. Okay. And then in the highs, I'm going to want to take out probably a little bit more. Again, I'm okay with taking out some of just sort of the air of the snare because that's mostly going to come from my overheads and the bleed in my overheads. Okay, so now let's go to our overheads. And overheads, you actually will commonly see a pretty dramatic cut. Still very, very light slope, but you will actually see a lot of tone cut coming from here so that you can really push up the sound of the cymbals without just starting to bring in mud into the mix. Kind of like that. And finally, let's check out our rooms. Rooms are like a combination of our overheads and our snare. We're going to want to cut some of the highs because they're farther away. We want to simulate that sense of depth. But we're going to cut a lot of the lows, kind of even into the main tone, because our lows and our low mids are coming from our kick and snare direct mics. We don't need a lot down there to get the girth that we're going for. So let me create this. I'm going to give it a very light slope, and we'll get going. Pretty good for me. Then let's make a high cut as well. Very subtle. Cool. And ideally, you're doing all of this in context of the entire drum kit. I'm showing it to you in solo just so that it's easier for you to hear it, but this is definitely something that is going to be best if you can hear how it's affecting the entire sound. Let's listen to the entire sound now. Do a quick before and after. It just got a lot tighter. We didn't really lose much of the tone, but we lost a lot of just the extra fluff. Now this is going to be so much easier to mix because it's not going to muddy everything up. Now, for our final two tips, we're going to be talking about compression. So let's talk about tip number 5, using what I call groove style compression on your drum bus and even your instrument buses if you need it to create some extra glue and some extra movement. So when I say groove style compression, what I basically mean is we are creating compression that causes a little bit more groove, a little bit more movement. We're creating compression that makes our head bob just a little bit more aggressively. So what that means is we are actually going to want to cause some subtle pumping. Now, usually pumping is not what you want with compression, especially outside of the electronic area. But if we're using it subtly and we're timing it to the tempo of the song, we can get some pretty amazing results. So I'm going to bring up a compressor right now, and I'm going to zero it out. So I'm going to turn the threshold and the ratio all the way up, the attack and release all the way down, take the knee all the way out. This is just for me setting up the compressor. It's going to sound bad at first, but that's what we want. For settings, if we're wanting to create pumping, we are going to want a slow attack and a fast release. Now, what that is going to do is it's going to get triggered by a drum sound. It's going to take some time for it to turn on, but it's going to turn off almost immediately. So you get this weird like wah kind of sound if you do it really aggressively. You know, if you ever hear that sort of bass sound that like wah, wah, wah in EDM, that's just really, really aggressive pumping. So what we're going to do that's special about this is we're actually going to time our settings to the tempo of the song. So I have right here a delay time calculator. It's a free one by the Lion's Den. You can get it online. And what it is I can put in the BPM of this song, and it gives me how many milliseconds, a quarter note is, or a dotted quarter note, or an eighth note, a 16th note, all these things, which is super helpful for helping to create that groove that we're talking about, because we want to make sure that we are getting something that's in time with the tempo. So that extra pump is helping to create almost like a sub accent. But before we get to that, let's set our threshold. Now, I probably want a deeper threshold on this. I want not just the peak to trigger this. I kind of want a lot of the valley of the sound, a lot of the sustain of the sound to also be triggering the compressor for this style of compression. Okay, it sounds bad, but it's doing what I want it to do. So now let's set up our attack and release. I'm still going to have the ratio up really high. That's the last thing I'm going to worry about. But I want my attack to be pretty slow, my release to be really fast. Let's try maybe a 64th note. It's about 29 milliseconds, roughly. Anything slower than 10 milliseconds on a compressor is a pretty slow attack time. So that's going to do what I want it to do. I'm just going to type in 29. So you can see we've got kind of just this weird thing where the peak is coming through, but everything else is getting lost. So now let's come off of the release time a bit. This is way too fast. Let's try doing 58 milliseconds. So that's a 30-second note. I'm digging that. I'm going to increase the knee just a hair, and I'm going to come all the way back on the ratio. And I'm going to slowly mix the ratio in until I'm getting, let's say, 2 to 3 dBs of compression. This is a subtle move. I'm not trying to do anything huge here. Just something subtle. Okay, now I'm going to add just a little bit of gain for makeup, and let's listen before and after. So one thing that I want to do before I finish, this is something that you often see with drum buses. You can see my kick is actually doing more compression than my snare. But in order for this to work the best it can, to get the most amount of groove, I gotta have my kick and my snare doing the same amount of compression. So I'm gonna go down here, and I'm actually gonna do some filtering on the ears of the compressor. This is just the sidechain filter. Now, you probably think of, when you think of sidechain, you think of telling the compressor to listen to another instrument and compress as if it was compressing that instrument, right? But the sidechain is actually just the ears of the compressor. There's an internal sidechain and an external sidechain. So if I'm filtering the sidechain, I'm not actually changing anything about the tone. I'm just telling the ears of the compressor, don't listen to this bit. It's still going to compress everything, but I'm just saying, don't listen to this little bit. So I'm going to move this filter up until I start to see my kicks and my snares have the same amount of compression. There we go. That's pretty good. Let's turn my ratio up a bit. Okay, now let's do a before and after. It's subtle, but you notice your head kind of starts to bob just a little bit more. So now you can actually take this one step further and put this same kind of compression on all of your sub buses as well. Oftentimes, you can really get some amazing movement because you're creating sort of like a consistent volume envelope on each of your sub mixes, but then you're also gluing everything together on your drum bus. You can get some really amazing results with it. I'm going to just copy everything over, and then I'm going to go in and tweak my threshold and a few other settings, my ratio as well, but I'm not going to change my attack and my release. I need those to stay pretty much the same. Now I'm going to go do some tweaking, and I'll see you in just a sec. So now that I've tweaked all of my settings, let's listen to a before and after. You can really feel the head bob, the fact that like you start just feeling the movement a little bit more after you've got all this compression. So finally, we've gotten to our last tip number 6 for great drums, and that is to put what I call thickness style compression on your rooms. So this is actually a really classic trick. It's something that you see in tons and tons of different records over the last 60 or 70 years. And really all it's doing is just some fast attack, fast release compression on the rooms to really bring the sound of the rooms out. We're just turning down the peaks so that we can bring up the valleys, kind of like that reverb. That allows us to mix the rooms in really subtly and get a lot of bigness without really affecting that much of the tone of the drum set. So we're going to set up our compressor same way. Let's just turn off all this stuff, take our knee all the way down. So let's start off with our threshold. Now we want a pretty high threshold. We really only want it to grab just the peaks, not anything underneath that. So I'm going to be a little bit more on the subtle side. That's pretty good. So now I'm going to want to change my attack and release. I still want a fast attack, fast release, but this is kind of insane. For a fast attack, I usually set it somewhere between 0.5 millisecond and 2 milliseconds. Much more than that. For drums, you're going to let those peaks go through. Let's just set it about right here for now. And for our release, we usually don't want anything faster than about 25 milliseconds. You start to get some weird distortion when you do that. So I'm probably going to set it probably around 50. But let's listen first. Looks good to me. Now I'm going to mess with the knee just a bit, just because I want to get more of that kick in there. And then I'm going to turn my ratio all the way down and start mixing it in. And this is a technique where you can get really aggressive compression if you want, or you can just do a dB or two if that's really all you need. Sounds pretty good. The trick to this style of compression is you want to make sure that you are turning up your gain so that all of the peaks are at the exact same level that they were at before. That's going to effectively turn up all the sustain of your sound. All that room sound is going to get turned up in the mix. So I'm going to go over and I'm going to look at where my room is peaking. I'm going to try to turn it up so that it's peaking at the exact same place. Let's turn that off and get going. It's about 24.9. So let's look at it now. Okay, so about 29. So we've lost about probably 4 dBs. So I'm going to add 4 decibels. Let's see if we can get it to peak the same area. Perfect. You can already hear it sounds so much thicker. So let's do a quick before and after. Just sounds huge, right? If we take that and we mix it into the entire drum set, we're going to be able to get some of that bigness of the room without really having to turn it up all that loud. That's too much. Perfect. It's just a hint. It's just a little bit. It doesn't need to be much more than that. But that sounds amazing to my ears. So now that we've gone through this entire process, let's see what our before and after sounds like. And there's still stuff for me to do. You know, in the context of a mix, I would still need to go in and make some tweaks. But these are the things that I'm going to either do or at least try on almost every single mix. So you're going to be able to hear the difference right now. It almost feels like I used some different samples on this or a reverb or something, but all it is some good routing, some good EQ moves, and a little compression. That's really it. So to review, here's all 6 things that I do on almost every one of my mixes. I make sure to make a drum bus and sub buses. I make sure to check the phase of all of my microphones. I make sure to check and see if there's any boxiness in any of my mics. I add some light filtering to create space in between all of my sub buses. I add a little bit of groove compression just to get that movement if I need it. And then I add a little bit of thickness compression on the room to really get some of that good room sound. And that's really it. Doing all 6 of those things on your mix is going to help to take your amateur sounding drum recordings to a whole new level. But don't forget, before you leave, we are giving away a free bonus. We've made our own cheat sheet for drum recording. So you're not only going to be able to get better sounds in the mix, but you're going to be able to get better sounds in your recordings as well. And really, the better recordings you can get, the better the mix is going to be. So if you are interested in grabbing this, just click the link on screen or down in the description below and we'll send you your free copy. I really think you're going to like it. And if this is your first time here, don't forget to subscribe. We make tips and tutorials just like this one all the time, every week. We'd love to help you grow. That's going to be it from me. This has been Dylan Pines with Musician on a Mission. And remember, create regardless.